Hello everyone. I'm looking at round 4 games from the 2016 Chao Memorial. This game is the last of the 3 decisive games that took place today. This one is between Boris Gelfand with the white pieces and Chao with the black pieces. And it took place in the Grunfeld Defense. So d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, knight f3, bishop g7, queen b3, d takes c4, castle, castle e4. Now this is known as the classical variation due to white's classical or traditional occupation of the center. I just want to go back here for a second. After queen takes b3, d takes c4 is not forced, although that is what you see mostly. So if you wanted to mix it up, or maybe surprise your opponent, c6 is quite playable. And for instance, after c takes d5, c takes d5, bishop g5, of course putting pressure on the defender of d4, e6, e3, castle, bishop e2, knight c6, h3, and h6. Black is almost equal. Okay, and that's from an old game from Sasanko and Oleg Romanician, and that's from Amsterdam 1973. So this is perfectly playable. Also, you don't always have to relinquish your center. Okay, but this is more popular. So d takes c4, queen takes c4, castle, and e4. And so you might ask, well, why does white, why does black allow white rather to erect a large center? Well, that's because black is arguing that white center cannot be adequately supported before the counterattack comes, and that the center will turn out to actually be a liability for white. And when I say the center, I mean the occupation of the center with pawns, because of course both players are fighting for the center. It's just that black is fighting for the center in a quote-unquote modern sense, in that he's affecting the center at a distance with his pieces, as opposed to the direct occupation of the center with pawns by white. And maybe 100 years ago, in the days of Tarish and those players that believed that you had to put 2 pawns in the center, they would look at a position like this and say white has the advantage and just walk away. But a lot of water has flowed under the bridge since those days, and black is able to fight against the center as long as he is able to break it down and attack it early. So e4 was played, knight a6. Now this is known as the it's old, you might not hear it anywhere else, but this is known as the Prins variation. That's P as in Peter, R-I-N-S, Prins variation. It's a grandmaster, Ludwig Prins. I think he was a grandmaster. He might have been IM, so check me on that. But it was definitely named after this strong player. Knight a6, and the idea is to exploit the presence of this queen here after the move. Actually, the main idea is c5. Secondary idea is exploiting the presence of this queen on c4, where it's a little bit exposed. Is to play c5, attacking the center, and then later on, of course, putting that rook on the c file. Alright, so after knight a6, bishop e2, there's c5, d5, e6, and notice how white center became a little bit weaker when the pawn duo is separated, namely these dark squares on d4 and e5. And that's one of the key elements. Is if you let your opponent erect the pawn center, you have to attack it fast and vigorously, or else the opponent will solidify that center and then maintain a space advantage. e6, castle. Other moves are possible. For instance, bishop g5 is perfectly respectable. Okay, so castle took place during the game. E takes d5. E takes d5. Notice the breakdown of white center now to an isolated pawn. Now we're not passing judgment on the isolated pawn here. Again, that would be a little bit too primitive and old school. See, back in the days, it was like, thought, okay, you have an isolated pawn, that's weak. Okay, again, now we know that it depends on the position. Sometimes the isolated pawn is weak and sometimes it's strong. So here the position is in flux. We don't know if the isolated pawn is weak or strong here yet. It depends on how both players continue on with the position. What we do know is that black must blockade that isolated pawn, fixing it as a target, and then attack it with all of his might to try to eliminate it. White, on his part, must try to protect that pawn with the pieces, since there's no pawns to protect it, and nurture that pawn up the board, and eventually threaten to become a queen. So the battle for the rest of the game pretty much is going to centralize around this idea of this pawn. Knight b4. So we see black using tempi to reorganize his knight, put his knight on the better square. So first, there's an attack here. See, two knights and the queen on this pawn. White has to defend it, so he plays the move rook d1. This is all pretty common. I just want you to know that instead of the move knight b4, an older move, bishop f5, is common, and this was actually played in the Karpov-Kasparov World Championship match in 1987. The move bishop f5, and that game, just to give you a couple of moves, game continue rook d1, rook e8, d6, h6, bishop f4. Notice the protection of the pawn. Knight d7, the blockade of the pawn. Rook d2, excuse me, and there's knight b4. There's that idea. So this was 1987, and you see a similar type position arising today. By the way, Karpov had the white pieces here, and Kasparov had the black pieces. That game had continued queen b3. There's bishop e6, exploiting the early presence of the queen in the middle game, in the middle of the board. Bishop c4, and then knight b6. Kasparov with the black pieces again. The game continued. Bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, and then here Karpov played a3, simply underestimating the dynamic Kasparov's next move, which he played knight d3, which is man, don't forget what type of player Kasparov was. Incredible, this incredible player. So I just wanted to give you an example that besides knight b4, the bishop can come to f5. So back to our game, knight b4. That game was drawn, by the way. I didn't even tell you the result. So rook d1, knight c2. Again, the purpose was to reposition this knight. So the knight here, excuse me, here, and the knight wants to end up there. So utilizing tempo, that's a good technique to use. If you can move with threats, that keeps your opponent most of the time from doing what he wants to do, and you can do what you want to do. So rook b1 and knight d4. Knight takes d4. Now you might be asking, well, why didn't he just take this pawn? Queen with queen takes c5. Now this pawn could be taken, but there is a price to pay here. Now here, I believe black would just simply capture this bishop on d2, moving this knight away. Knight takes e2, knight takes e2, bishop f5, attacking the rook. Okay. Then b6, protecting that pawn, and then preparing to move this rook. So for instance, after queen b5, bishop c2, d4, knight e4, unleashing discovered attack and preparing the blockade of the pawn with knight e6. So rook b4, a5, and then the rook gets jammed up. If it goes back to d4, it just gets captured. And if the rook goes there, then that spells trouble for white. So basically, of course, that's not an exact line, but that's basically the problems that white would run into in capturing the c5 pawn. The general idea to remember is this, is that white's pieces are not really coordinated that well. So white really, to make his position better, he has to kind of like unravel a little bit. His rook on b1 is a little bit awkward. His queen really shouldn't be there, a little exposed, and he really can't waste time capturing pawns. Black has a really dynamic position. Excuse me. Black has a dynamic position. So for instance, he often will sacrifice the c pawn and then bring this rook to the c file with tempi. So white has to be very careful in accepting gambits at this stage from black, and really has to worry about consolidating and coordinating his pieces. So that's like the general spirit of it, you know. So knight takes d4 is played, c takes d4, and rook takes d4, and this is what I'm talking about. Notice the rook is here, so black sacrifices a pawn, but the bishop is powerful. So white has a pawn, but his pieces look real weird. They're not in like good locations. So he has the material, but the position is a little bit suspect. So what's Gelfand's job here? Gelfand's job is to try to gradually, you know, untangle his position and emerge with the pawn advantage going into the endgame. What's black's job here? What's black's plan? Black's plan is to keep the chaos in the position. Keep as much chaos in the position as possible. Creating threats, attacking move, dynamic play, in other words. Using the open files, the E file and the C file. Using his light squared bishop. Right? For instance, bringing it to F5, attacking the rook on B1. Using the C file to expose the queen on C4, gaining tempi, etc. That's black's job. And eventually, all of that activity and threat making will turn into gain of material. So these are like one player wants to keep things calm, one player wants to keep things chaotic. There it is, bishop f5. Again, operating with threats. So now the rook has to go back to the starting point and look at the development for black. Again, another attacking move by black. This move has a couple of purposes. It's not just simply to attack this rook. Knight e6, blockade. Because remember, if you know about isolated pawns, they have to be blockaded. They should be blockaded and then attacked. So that knight ideally would like to be on d6. Gelfand senses the urgency in the situation. He says, you know what, take the rook. That way my dark square bishop will be able to dominate the squares, and this one will be gone. Chao says, you know what, I'm playing my blockade plan. I'm going right here. Knight d6, fixing this pawn, and we'll discuss the other issues later. Queen c5, attacking, but it's not a real attack because any exchange on d6 will lead to the rook being captured. So for instance, rook e8 was played, by the way, but for instance, if I'm sorry, after rook e8, which was played, if queen takes, you obviously see that this is hanging. So queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, followed by that. And if bishop takes d6, same issues. Bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, and queen takes d4. So rook e8 was played, and bishop b5. So we see the attack here. This forces, it's kind of like a trade right here, a trade-off. This forces black to remove his blockade, which he doesn't really want to do. But white gives up the bishop here and leaves black with the two bishops. So it's kind of like a trade-off. Again, another threat. So, and notice too how black is willing just to give up the pawn. It's not a big deal because of the dynamic nature of the activity. You see how black occupies the two open files in the position. Bishops on full diagonals. You cannot really ask for more in the position. Only thing, if black had his wish, black would love to have a knight here or piece here just blockading this pawn. That's the only thing. Because this pawn is dangerous. Notice how white is surrounding the pawn with pieces and just escorting it up the board. Kind of like it's like a presidential candidate or something. Just protecting it, protecting it, protecting it. Queen takes a7. So the queen figures, hey, if I have to move somewhere, I might as well get a pawn for it. Now, this is the difference between dynamic and static advantages. White has the static advantage. What does that mean? Well, like if you were to take the heavy pieces off the board, like the queens, rooks, etc., even, take the heavy pieces off the board and go into a, a late middle game to the end game, white would probably clearly be winning with the 2-pawn advantage. However, before the end game, the gods of chess have created the middle game, and in this middle game position, black has more than enough compensation for his pawn deficit due to the domination of the open files and the domination of the open diagonals, the presence and having the two bishops in the position, and due to white's lack of coordination, the pieces. His rook is still under attack and awkwardly placed on defense, ushering the pawn up the board, and this other rook has not even moved yet. Right, it's moved, but technically it hasn't moved because it went back. Okay, so after queen takes a7, another threat. Now, here's another feature in the position. You might say, well, why did Li Chao do that? Here's another feature in the position. Notice the 3 pawns right here and the king on the back rank. This rook is, if this rook on a1 is in here, it's checkmate. And that's the main idea behind Li Chao's move right here, rook a8. The queen moves back to c5, and of course Gelfand would probably at this point love a repetition with rook c8. But rook takes a2, and of course if rook, I'll just show you, if rook takes a2, then the game is over. It's checkmate. So of course that wasn't played. Gelfand is stronger than that. So rook a d1 instead. Now Li Chao cashes in, plays bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, another threat involving the queen. Notice that early exposure of the queen in the beginning of the game led to a lot of trouble. So rook e4, queen d2. White is still sticking to the this plan, holding on to this isolated pawn and trying to lead it to victory. Notice that white protects this pawn and the square in front of it so that it can continue to advance. So this is like really an interesting position, because black is up the exchange but down a pawn, and white has a pass pawn in the middle of the board that is escorting up the board. Game continued with more threats. Queen b6. Now if this knight moves, this pawn is in jeopardy. So knight c3, attacking the rook. And so we have a fork here. Of course, Li Chao has calculated this already. Rook takes b2. Rook takes b2 threatens the queen, so therefore this knight cannot capture the rook on e4, although it would love to. Gelfand decides it's the moment of truth and does capture it anyway. So, I mean, of course, I'm trying to find some kind of move for white. Of course, he could have played a move, you know, say like a queen, excuse me, like queen to c1 or something, and try to, you know, keep the queens. But it looks pretty rough. I mean, I'm just looking at the surface at a move like rook c4, for instance. This, I'm sorry, not. I'm looking at rook c4, but then that's what happens when you don't use engines. Okay, now I see. Now I see it clear. Rook c4. I was looking at this pin first, but obviously there's just the threat of queen takes f2 check and mate coming after that. So the queen basically can't even move off this rank. Of course, it can't go here because there's simply rook takes. So he's in a world of trouble here. Though it looks like the dynamic possibilities are winning out. So this is why knight takes e4 happened. Rook takes d2. And knight takes d2. And for all intents and purposes, white is lost. But now it's a technical issue. He still has a passed pawn. So again, he just attacks that real quick. Again, threat. Knight can't move because of the rook. So Gelfand fights on, plays bishop e3. The isolated pawn finally falls ingloriously. So we see that in this game, the victory fell to the modern player. So that's a victory for the modern approach to the center over the classical approach to the center. And that variation in the Grunfeld, by the way, is called the classical variation. So we see in this game that the modern approach finally destroying the weak set occupation of the center by white. Is finally won out. Game continued. Rook c1, and I want to show you the great ending, so I'm just gonna speed through these moves real quick. b5 was played. Gelfand fights valiantly. Now it's black who's trying to threaten to win the queen here, and that's what's going on in these next couple of moves. Not win the queen, but promote a queen with his b pawn. So rook d4, queen f8, and that pawn just keeps going. Great move by Chao. He sacrifices the bishop, understanding that this pawn cannot be stopped except by sacrifice. So he basically wins the other exchange. g5 is played. Queen b1 check, driving the king in the corner. Knight is attacked, and all Gelfand can hope for right now is to try to build some kind of impregnable fortress where the queen cannot get through. Now what's about to take place here is one of the great king walks that I've seen in a long time. The most famous king walk, I think, is probably the game of Nigel Short versus Jan Timman in the Grunfeld Defense. Google that one if you haven't seen that game. But basically, the queen is not going to be able to win this game by herself. It needs the king. So therefore, the king has to take that long walk down here and assist in the checkmate attempt. So let's enjoy that. So knight g2, king f7, knight h4, queen d1, bishop f4, king e6, king g3, king d5, and here comes the king. Knight f3. There's a threat, right? So the king is there now. Another piece. Check. King d3, king g2. Here comes the king. Queen a4, king g3, queen b4, bishop f4. That's threatened right there. Bishop e3, queen d6 check, bishop f4, again threatening the f2 pawn. And that's a killer move right there, because somebody has to move. That's a fork, right? So bishop takes f4, queen takes f2 check, out. King g4, queen g1 check, king h4, queen to g2, and Gelfand resigned. I mean, the game is over after that. Starts running out of moves. So for instance, after any kind of bishop move, either the bishop will be lost or the knight is lost. So for instance, the bishop d6, then the knight just drops. If bishop here, just capture the bishop. So it's hard to make any kind of moves like that. And once the pieces start getting separated from each other, for instance, I don't know, knight c4, then those will be picked up in short order. Matter of fact, here white has probably made it. Say for instance, after queen f4 check, f2 check, king g4, and that's what I see right there. Queen f3, and where's the mate? Oh yeah, king h4, and queen takes f4 check, mate. So this is why Gelfand resigned in the final position. So anyway, hope you enjoyed that game. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next series of videos.